12 million people didn't tune in for entertainment. They watched because something felt different. In a world where shouting wins ratings and silence gets edited out, one woman stepped into a studio not to speak louder, but to stand still and refuse to blink. She wasn't supposed to win. The cameras were already pointed the other way. The narrative was scripted. The clips were pre-cut. The host, a judge with decades of media power, had every advantage. But Jasmine Crockett didn't bring an entourage. She didn't bring talking points. She brought a black folder, a USB drive, and the kind of quiet conviction that doesn't need applause to land like thunder. And when she placed that USB on the table, everything changed. Within hours, the footage ignited a firestorm. A respected judge vanished without a word. Corporate sponsors pulled out, and a nation that had grown numb to spectacle suddenly leaned in, not to a scream, but to a sentence so precise it cracked the mask of performance wide open. So what was on that tape? And how did one woman dismantle decades of manipulation without ever raising her voice? To answer that, we have to go back to the day she walked into that studio, alone. The email didn't scream. It didn't shout. It came in quietly at 10:42 a.m. on a Thursday morning, subject line lowercase. Race and reform, a conversation. No bold fonts, no executive producer name. Just a junior assistant with a clipped signature and an overly polite tone. Jasmine Crockett had seen hundreds of these invitations before, but this one lingered. Something about it felt off. There was no pre-call, no outline of topics, no list of panelists. The email mentioned a time, a studio, and the phrase, a national dialogue on justice. That was it. For most public figures, that would be enough to raise a flag. But Jasmine didn't forward it to her staff. She didn't schedule a strategy call. She just read it once, then clicked archive. She already knew what it was. These weren't conversations. These were ambushes dressed in commercial breaks. And the moment she saw who the host was, the justice with Judge Jeanine Pirro, it wasn't a matter of if this would be hostile. It was a matter of how far they were willing to go. But Jasmine didn't hesitate. She didn't bring in consultants or craft sound bites. She didn't warn her allies in the caucus or request backup from advocacy groups. She did something unexpected. She accepted. Not because she trusted the show, not because she believed in a good faith dialogue, but because she knew that silence could be mistaken for retreat. And Jasmine Crockett didn't retreat, not from microphones, not from power, and certainly not from people who built their platforms attacking the very communities she was elected to protect. But here's what no one outside her circle knew. 3 days before the email arrived, Jasmine had received something else. Quietly, anonymously, a flash drive, no note, no return address. Just a file labeled Segment 5, Off-Air Footage, 2020. She didn't open it immediately. She stared at it for a full 10 minutes. Then slowly, she slid it into the inner pocket of her blazer. She would wait. There's a certain type of power that doesn't come from title or tenure. It comes from knowing when to speak and when to let others expose themselves. Jasmine wasn't walking into a studio that day for a debate. She was walking into a trap she had already mapped. And that made her dangerous. What none of them knew, not the producers, not the host, not even her own team, was that Jasmine Crockett didn't come to defend her name. She came to change the story. And the moment the red light turned on and that camera lens blinked open like an eye ready to judge her, she wasn't the one being evaluated. They were. And that drive in her blazer, that wasn't just evidence, it was the fuse. The black town car eased to a stop at the side entrance of the network building, far from the main doors where most guests were ushered in under lights and lenses. No reporters waited here, no flashing bulbs, no chaos, just a concrete service ramp slick with early dew, and a side door that clicked open with a mechanical sigh the moment the driver hit the brakes. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for anyone to open her door. She stepped out slowly, deliberately, like someone walking into a courtroom. Not to argue, but to issue a verdict. She wore black, not the elegant kind that begged to be noticed, but the kind that refused to reflect light. Matte, structured, no accessories, no earrings, no brooches. The only visible color on her was the glint of a brushed steel clasp on the thin black folder tucked neatly under her left arm, and the faint metallic curve of a USB drive she slipped into her blazer pocket with surgical precision. Not for drama, not to intimidate, but to remind herself that this was not a performance. It was preparation. The hallway inside the building was colder than expected. It hummed with quiet intention. Polished floors, white fluorescent lighting, and a faint antiseptic scent that felt less like hospitality and more like sterilization. A young assistant in a headset greeted her with a whisper, as if unsure of the volume protocol for someone who didn't match the noise of the place. "We'll take you through Studio 3. Just a quick mic check, then you're on." Jasmine nodded once. No smile, no small talk. Her heels tapped in slow, measured rhythm, the only sound in the corridor, like a countdown. Around the corner, behind a bank of monitors, two producers leaned in as they watched her approach on the surveillance feed. One raised an eyebrow. The other whispered, "She looks tense." But they were wrong. Jasmine wasn't tense. She was sharpened. There's a difference. Tension wavers. Sharpness cuts. And Jasmine was about to cut. They had expected a reactive guest, someone who would match Jeanine's tone, rise to the bait, get flustered on cue. Their prep notes were filled with phrases like high conflict segment, an emotional trigger point. They'd even preloaded clips they hoped would rattle her. But what entered that studio wasn't the woman they thought they'd booked. It wasn't the version of Jasmine they had seen through their edited montages or opposition research files. It was the version that had survived real hearings, real crossfire, real loss. The woman who didn't flinch when truths turned dangerous. As the assistant opened the last door leading into the darkened soundstage, Jasmine paused for half a beat. Not out of hesitation, out of discipline, a breath, a reset, a moment to take in the air of a room that had been built to bury people like her in applause tracks and sound bites. But she didn't feel buried. She felt still. And stillness, she knew, could be lethal if you waited long enough for someone else to fill the silence with fear. The studio was colder than the hallway, not by temperature, but by intent. Light panels glowed above the set, casting everything in a soft amber filter, designed to feel warm, but calculated to control shadows. The moderator desk gleamed under the gloss of fresh polish. Two chairs faced each other like opposing counsel, with a wide screen hung silently in the background, like a waiting gavel. Jasmine stepped in without hesitation. Jeanine Pirro was already seated, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Posture pristine, expression unreadable except for the corners of her mouth, which didn't quite smile. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said with just enough edge to suggest courtesy without comfort. "We're so glad you could join us tonight." The cameras weren't rolling yet, but the performance had already begun. Jasmine took her seat without a word, placing her black folder on the table as if it were a legal brief. She didn't look at the host, not yet. She looked at the set, the angles, the placement of the cameras, the light reflection off the desk. She wasn't soaking it in, she was assessing it, like someone studying the geometry of a battlefield. She already knew where the ambush would come from. She just didn't know what form it would take. Then the floor manager gave a countdown. 3, 2, 1. The red on-air light blinked to life. "Good evening, America," Pirro's voice rang out, smooth and composed, practiced from years of courtrooms and primetime monologues. "Tonight we welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to discuss a topic that's dividing the nation, racial justice and its so-called champions. Are they healers or hustlers?" She turned toward Jasmine. "Congresswoman, let's begin." "No, how are you?" No warm-up, no preamble, just heat. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, just enough to suggest amusement or caution. "Define hustler," she said coolly. Pirro didn't answer. Instead, she raised a manicured finger toward the screen behind them. "Let's let the viewers decide." The screen lit up. A video began playing, cropped, uncaptioned, preloaded. It was Jasmine in a congressional hearing, voice sharp, eyes blazing, pointing at a police chief during testimony on excessive force. The audio was muted, but the visual was enough. A black woman in righteous fury. The kind of clip that could be used to define or distort, depending on the intent. Pirro let it hang in the air like smoke. This is who you are, isn't it? Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't blink. She didn't even look at the screen, because she already knew what came next. And so did the audience. Even if they didn't understand why their breath had suddenly caught in their throats. The trap had been sprung. But the one they thought was cornered, she hadn't even moved yet. The clip ended, the screen faded to black, and Jeanine Pirro turned back to the camera, her voice laced with the same brand of polished condescension she'd perfected over years of courtroom drama and cable news theatrics. America just saw a glimpse of what many believe is the real Jasmine Crockett, she said, fiery, confrontational, quick to accuse and quicker to condemn. Congresswoman, is this what leadership looks like to you? Jasmine didn't answer right away. Her silence wasn't passive. It was precise. She let the question float, heavy and overseasoned, inviting its own weight to suffocate. She had heard it all before. Not always in those exact words, but always with the same intention. Control the optics. Paint the woman as loud, angry, unstable. It didn't matter that her anger had been justified or that her voice had carried the weight of grieving mothers and broken communities. The goal here wasn't dialogue. It was distortion. Pirro continued, sensing the pause as an opening. She gestured to a stack of papers off camera. I've reviewed your statements in multiple hearings, and what I see is a pattern. Accusations without evidence. Language meant to incite, not to unite. In 2022, you told a congressional panel that policing in America feels more like punishment than protection. Would you call that an objective assessment, or was it just political theater for your base? The word theater hung in the air like a slap dressed as a handshake. And still, Jasmine didn't bite. She let it sit. The audience, both in studio and watching from their homes, waited for her to react. A retort, a rebuttal, a rise in her voice that could confirm what Pirro was carefully constructing, a narrative of over-emotion, of instability. But Jasmine didn't rise. She stayed still. Pirro leaned in, eyes narrowing. Are you here to legislate or to perform? There it was. The line, the one crafted in the production meeting, rehearsed just enough to sound improvised. But Jasmine recognized it immediately. Not as a question, but as a trigger. It was never about the content. It was about the framing. The goal was to bait her into emotion and then call it evidence. It was a tactic as old as the systems she'd been fighting her entire career. And yet, even now, Jasmine's hands rested calmly on the table. Her expression didn't harden. Her voice didn't rise. She let Pirro throw every rehearsed jab, every slanted clip, every implication, because Jasmine wasn't in that chair to react. She was in that chair to reveal. And the performance, it wasn't hers. It was the one unfolding right across from her, beneath powdered cheekbones and a script masked as concern. And the audience, whether they knew it yet or not, was watching the wrong woman. For a moment, there was nothing. No camera cut, no comment, no cue for commercial. Just the sound of controlled breath in a studio trained for spectacle. Jeanine Pirro, sensing she'd landed something, sat slightly forward in her chair, chin high, shoulders square, hands folded neatly as if she were delivering closing arguments. She was the judge again, the one in charge, the one with the spotlight. Or so she thought. And then Jasmine moved. Not much, just a slow uncrossing of her hands, one palm sliding over the other, her fingers pressing gently into the table, as if feeling the wood beneath them. Her eyes lifted, not to the camera, but to Jeanine's face. She didn't blink quickly. She didn't swallow hard. She simply looked. The kind of look that made a person question whether they were still in control of the room, or if they'd just handed the floor over without realizing. And then she spoke. I don't perform, Jasmine said, her voice quiet but full. I represent. It wasn't loud, it wasn't defiant, but it landed with a stillness that changed the shape of the air. Even the studio lights seemed to pause, their hum dulling under the weight of the sentence. Jeanine opened her mouth to speak, but the audience caught it first. Something shifted. Their attention, once calibrated to flare and fire, had turned inward. They weren't leaning forward for combat anymore. They were listening. Jasmine leaned in slightly, just enough to claim space. I represent districts where mothers bury sons and still have to smile for their other children. I represent communities where 911 isn't a promise of safety, but a coin flip of survival. I represent voices that don't get edited into prime time unless they're screaming or sobbing. She paused, not for effect, but to breathe. I know what this segment was designed to be. You don't have to say it, she continued, eyes still locked on Jeanine. I was meant to be a foil, a moment of drama between commercials. The angry black woman trope dressed up as political contrast. You brought me here hoping I'd make it easy to confirm what you've already told your viewers to believe. Jeanine shifted in her seat. Subtly, but enough. Jasmine didn't blink. But I didn't come here to make anyone comfortable. I came here because people like me don't always get to answer back. We get misquoted, clipped, miscast. So today I'm not defending myself, I'm defending the truth. Silence. The control room didn't move. No new prompt in Jeanine's earpiece. No pre-scripted transition, just an eerie, rare stillness. The kind that only happens when the intended narrative loses oxygen. Jasmine sat back gently, her voice softened, but her gaze sharpened. You said you watched those hearings, but you didn't hear them. You saw fire, but you missed the fuel. Maybe now, you'll start to ask what lit it. And for the first time, Jeanine Pirro didn't have a response. She just sat there. Perfect posture, perfect lighting, and a story that was no longer hers to control. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean across the table or point her finger. She simply reached into the inside pocket of her blazer with the same calm she'd carried since walking into the building, and withdrew a small black USB drive, slim, unmarked, ordinary. But the moment it hit the table with a soft click, the mood in the studio shifted. Jeanine Pirro's posture tightened. The control room, watching through headsets and screens, fell uncharacteristically quiet. Let's play this one, Jasmine said evenly, tapping the USB once with her index finger. There was no threat in her tone, no flourish, just certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need explanation, because it knows the room is about to learn something it can't unlearn. Jeanine blinked once, her face composed but betraying a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't in the rundown. This wasn't part of the script. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Jasmine added calmly, I've already cleared the file for air. The truth doesn't need post-production. In the booth above, a junior tech whispered into his headset, Is this cleared? Do we have approval? The producer didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the feed. Another assistant hovered over the input console, hand unsure, waiting for a go-ahead that never came. The silence stretched. Then Jasmine turned slightly, her voice directed toward the control room without looking away from Pirro. Go ahead. You'll want to see this too. And just like that, the trap turned inside out. The audience, who had been watching with the expectation of drama designed to confirm their biases, now leaned forward with something deeper, curiosity. The segment was no longer unfolding the way it was supposed to. The woman who was meant to be flustered was now making requests. The host, who was meant to control the conversation, suddenly looked like she was trying to regain her grip. Pirro spoke, her voice clipped. We don't accept unsolicited media. Jasmine didn't move. Then don't think of it as unsolicited. Think of it as overdue. The screen behind them flickered briefly, a black frame blinking twice as the control room hesitated, then caved. The signal switched. The file loaded. A spinning circle appeared in the center of the screen, then resolved into a time-stamped freeze frame marked Segment 5 Off Air. Jasmine leaned back just slightly. The room felt smaller now, not because the walls had changed, but because the illusion of control had. And as the first few seconds of unfiltered footage began to roll, one thing became clear to everyone watching. On set, at home, online. This was no longer Jeanine Pirro's segment, it was Jasmine Crockett's. The clip didn't begin with drama, it began with dimness. The studio lights lowering, the crew shuffling, the sound of a mic being unclipped. The image on the screen showed the familiar set of justice with Judge Jeanine, but the mood was entirely different. No graphics, no dramatic intro music, just a static camera rolling unintentionally in the quiet aftermath of a segment. The footage was dated 2 years prior. Jeanine Pirro appeared on screen, seated behind the same desk she occupied now. But this version of her was off script. She looked tired, annoyed, her makeup slightly smudged under the hot studio lights. She rolled her eyes as a production assistant approached and asked a question just off mic. Her response was low, casual even, but unmistakable. "I don't care about the truth as long as the ratings stay up." The words dropped like lead. Gasps rippled across the audience. Not dramatic ones, startled ones. Sharp inhales, hands tightening around armrests. Even through the speakers it sounded raw. It didn't feel like a scandalous accusation. It felt like an unguarded confession. The kind people make when they've forgotten the camera is still rolling. The kind that tells you everything you need to know. Not just about a person, but about the machine they feed. The control booth erupted in whispers. One producer stood frozen. Another reached instinctively for the manual override button. The host in the present, Jeanine, sat stone still, watching her own words echo back across the set. "I don't care about the truth." Jasmine didn't flinch. "As long as the ratings stay up." There was no music cue, no network branding, just a full 4-second pause after the statement, where the Jeanine on screen took a long sip of water, shook her head, and muttered something else too low to catch. The clip ended there. The screen went black. Silence. Not just the polite kind, the absolute kind. No movement, no cough, no breath. For a beat too long, it felt like no one in the room knew what came next. Because no one had scripted this moment. Not the producers, not the moderators, not the PR team huddled behind the glass. Jasmine stayed perfectly still, not triumphant, not gloating, just still, the way a courtroom quiets before the verdict is read. Jeanine finally turned her eyes from the screen, back to the camera, but for once there was no rhetoric ready, no pivot, no outrage to weaponize, just exposure, just her words. And for the first time in a very long career, the woman who had made a living delivering verdicts was now the subject of one. The screen behind them faded to black, but the weight of what had just been said, caught, recorded, played for all to hear, still hung in the air like a courtroom echo. Jeanine Pirro remained motionless, lips slightly parted, a flicker of calculation behind her still gaze. Her defense had been stripped from her, not by opinion, but by her own words. The audience hadn't moved, neither had Jasmine. But something had cracked, not loud, not visible, just the first fault line beneath a structure too long protected by polish and persona. And then Jasmine moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. Her right hand simply slid down, reached beneath the gleaming surface of the desk, and retrieved a slim manila folder. The one that had been with her from the beginning, untouched, unopened until now. She placed it on the table softly, like evidence submitted for the record. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the audience. She looked at Jeanine. "I didn't come here to expose you," Jasmine said, her voice even. "But if the truth wants out, I won't stand in its way." She flipped the folder open, revealing the Department of Justice seal stamped in red across the header of the first page. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't speculation. It was official. Dated, numbered, certified. She lifted the page between her fingers and began reading aloud. Not with drama, but with the cold precision of someone who knows exactly where every line leads. "This," Jasmine began, "is a summary of a federal investigation into your involvement in the attempted installation of unauthorized surveillance equipment in a private vehicle, registered to your former spouse." She paused just long enough to let the words sink in. Jeanine's jaw shifted. Barely. "The report alleges that you used your position as a sitting judge to access sealed court records, then leverage that access to obtain a private security firm willing to place a listening device without consent." Jasmine turned another page. Federal privacy laws, obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial authority. Still no reaction from Pirro. But the stillness wasn't power anymore. It was defense. The crew behind the cameras looked at one another, some with narrowed eyes, others frozen mid-motion. A sound tech near the side stage stopped adjusting a mic and just stared, boom pole dangling inches from the floor. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. "There is no accusation here," she said, "only documentation." She slid the folder forward, slow and deliberate, until it stopped just inches from Jeanine's hands. "You sat on the bench," Jasmine continued, "and called yourself an officer of the law. But this," she tapped the cover once, gently, "this is the legacy you tried to keep sealed." Jeanine's fingers didn't move toward the file. Her shoulders did not square. Her lips did not part. But her eyes, just barely, betrayed the truth. She recognized the folder, not from hearsay, from memory, and the audience, now fully silent, began to understand. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a revelation. The folder rested on the table like a final nail, quiet but immovable. Jeanine Pirro didn't touch it. Her hands, once so sure in their gestures, now hovered uncertainly above the surface, one inching toward a glass of water, the other twitching ever so slightly. A seasoned camera operator instinctively read the moment and zoomed in. Not on Jasmine, not on the folder, but on that hand, perfectly manicured, motionless at first, then trembling just enough to catch the studio light. That tremble said more than any rebuttal ever could. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't turn toward the camera for effect. She didn't adjust her posture or prepare a monologue. She simply sat, gaze unwavering, spine straight, hands folded in front of her like she was still in a hearing room, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge the record. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full of weight, of consequence, of power earned, not projected. Across from her, Jeanine tried to speak. Twice. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Only the subtle tightening of her jaw, the shallow rise of her shoulders as if trying to summon a defense from a place where none existed. She glanced to the control booth, as if seeking guidance, but the producers didn't move. No cues were fed into her earpiece. No rescue came from the glass pane behind the cameras, because no one knew what to say. And that silence, that terrifying, suffocating silence, was louder than the roar the show had prepared for. The studio was still on air, but it no longer felt like a broadcast. It felt like a courtroom where the judge had lost her gavel and the witness had just rewritten the case. Jasmine didn't need a verdict. The room had already rendered one. One by one, you could feel it. The audience members who had arrived for confrontation, realizing they were watching something different, something undeniable. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was gravitational. Jasmine hadn't shouted. She hadn't even raised a finger, but she had taken command of the space in a way no interruption could undo. The evidence had been placed, the words had already aired. The cracks in the mask were no longer invisible. Jeanine's hand moved again, not to push the folder away, not to close it, but to steady itself beside the glass, now trembling slightly from where her fingers had brushed it. The water inside rippled, a mirror of the room's new current. Jasmine remained still. That stillness, once misread as composure, was now revealed as control, quiet, precise, lethal. And as the final frame lingered on Pirro's silence, the truth settled into every corner of the studio. Heavy, final, and beyond denial. Jasmine Crockett hadn't won the argument. She had ended it. The moment the broadcast ended, the real story began. It didn't wait for a press release or an evening headline. It didn't ask permission from network executives or pass through newsroom filters. It ignited where truth always burns hottest now, on the internet. Within 6 minutes of the show going off air, the first clip appeared. A shaky phone recording aimed at a living room screen. No commentary, no edits, just Jasmine Crockett's line. "I don't perform. I represent." Then the camera panned to Jeanine Pirro, frozen, breath caught, hand trembling near a folder she would not touch. The caption was simple. She didn't flinch. It was retweeted 30,000 times in the first hour. By the second hour, hashtags surged. Our Let Truth Speak. Pirro exposed, Justice Live. They weren't just trending, they were accelerating. Faster than the network's PR team could draft a response. Faster than studio executives could strategize. Clips were clipped from other clips. Edits were remixed. Side-by-side comparisons surfaced. Jeanine's shouting in past interviews versus Jasmine's silence on that night. One account zoomed in on the glass of water. The ripple. That alone racked up 3 million views in 8 hours. But it wasn't just social media that responded. Corporate email servers started lighting up by the third hour. 3 major sponsors, 1 banking institution, 1 pharmaceutical giant, 1 consumer tech brand, issued nearly identical statements by midnight. We are reviewing our relationship with the network in light of recent developments. The words were polished, distant, designed for damage control, but everyone knew what they meant. The money was moving. By sunrise, media analysts were calling it a broadcast detonation. Former interns at the network shared stories anonymously of rehearsed takedowns, of pressure to agitate guests of color, of moments left on the cutting room floor that could have told a different truth. The clip from the USB, the off-air confession, was played on every independent media outlet across the spectrum. Left, right, center, because no matter the politics, the sentence was too raw to ignore. I don't care about the truth as long as the ratings stay up. The line played on loop, over screenshots, over commentary, over protest signs in Times Square before noon the next day. But it was Jasmine's restraint that held the spotlight. It wasn't just what she exposed, it was how she exposed it. Not with shouting, not with spin, with stillness. The world hadn't seen someone unravel a media empire without a raised voice since, well, maybe never. And the audience, the people who had watched the segment expecting another clash, another soundbite, suddenly realized they hadn't witnessed noise. They'd witnessed clarity. And once clarity is viral, there's no going back. Saturday night arrived like clockwork. The time slot where Jeanine Pirro had sat, week after week, face framed in confidence, voice sharpened like a blade. The familiar logo faded in. The intro music played, but something was different. There was no countdown, no monologue, no host, just a stand-in anchor with the charisma of a cardboard cutout, reading headlines like filler between commercial breaks. No acknowledgement, no explanation, just a sentence, dropped at the top of the hour like a cough in a cathedral. Judge Pirro is off this evening. Will return to regular programming shortly. Off this evening. That was all they said. Not on leave, not pre-recorded, not traveling, just off. But the audience had already seen too much. The silence around her absence was deafening. For a woman who had spent her career feeding off immediacy, who prided herself on being first to respond, to condemn, to define the narrative, the fact that she said nothing became its own kind of confession. Her social media pages, usually hyperactive, went dormant. Scheduled posts vanished. No weekend commentary, no damage control, just stillness. And for the first time, that stillness didn't belong to Jasmine. It belonged to Jeanine. Inside the network, panic moved like a current behind closed doors. The PR director's inbox was flooded. Executives debated strategy behind frosted glass conference room doors. A special internal memo circulated, refrain from public comment, do not engage. It didn't matter. The clips were already out. The hashtags already viral. The quote already burned into the internet's collective memory. You couldn't unhear it. You couldn't unsee it. And most of all, you couldn't spin it. That was the most devastating truth of all. Her defenders tried. They called it a smear campaign, a political setup, a trap engineered by a media-savvy radical. But the arguments fell flat, because the footage wasn't third-hand. It wasn't anonymous. It was her voice, her words, her decision, and no amount of partisan framing could make it less real. Commentators on rival networks watched with visible discomfort. Some tiptoed around the story. Others addressed it sideways, referring to her as a veteran voice now facing scrutiny. But no one could say what they used to, that she was untouchable, because clearly she wasn't. and the machine she'd built, carefully, strategically, ruthlessly, began to turn on itself. Advertisers hesitated. Booking teams canceled upcoming guests. One senior executive, speaking off the record, admitted, "It's not about what happened. It's about what we can't control anymore." Control. That was the word. That was the illusion. And now that illusion had cracked wide open, not in an explosion, but in retreat. Jeanine Pirro didn't lose the argument. She vanished from it. And when a woman whose entire brand is visibility suddenly disappears, the silence doesn't just raise questions, it answers them. By Monday morning, the confrontation had stopped being about Jasmine, Crockett, and Jeanine Pirro. It had become something else, something bigger, something louder than any segment, deeper than any headline. The clip, once just a moment of television, had transformed into a mirror, and America was being forced to look into it. Civil rights organizations moved swiftly. The NAACP issued a rare joint statement, not just in support of Jasmine's composure, but in condemnation of the media playbook exposed that night. The baiting, the silencing, the reduction of complex voices into viral templates. What we witnessed, the statement read, was not an argument, it was a reclamation. Former staffers from Pirro's own production team began to speak anonymously. They described editorial meetings where guests were cast like characters, where producers asked for conflict moments rather than clarity. One woman who had worked behind the scenes for over a year told a reporter, "Jasmine didn't break the format, she exposed it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it." Media critics followed. Op-eds emerged from The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, even some conservative outlets, admitting, grudgingly or not, that what had aired was not just political theater gone wrong, but evidence of a deeper rot. Editors and anchors began using the term, the Crockett precedent. It referred not just to the viral moment, but to the uncomfortable truth it revealed, that control isn't the same as truth, and silence isn't the same as weakness. Journalism schools weighed in next. Professors across the country added the broadcast to their curricula overnight. One called it a modern case study in narrative manipulation and its collapse. Another professor at Howard University framed it more bluntly. Jasmine Crockett turned stillness into strategy and strategy into cultural rupture. The response wasn't limited to institutions. People on the ground, ordinary viewers, began speaking out, not just in tweets and reaction videos, but in forums, classrooms, and town halls. Black mothers replayed Jasmine's quiet defiance as a lesson for their daughters. Veterans of social justice movements called it the moment the formula cracked. And young activists, some of whom had never heard of Crockett before that night, printed her words onto placards. "I don't perform, I represent." It wasn't just the exposure of one host, it was the exposure of an entire infrastructure built to disguise bias as balance and control as conversation. Jasmine didn't just defend herself, she gave voice to every person who'd ever been cut off mid-sentence, misquoted, framed, edited, and dismissed. The moment had shifted. This was no longer about one woman's silence. It was about who had been silenced for far too long. And now, finally, someone had answered back. Not by shouting over the noise, but by refusing to become part of it. In the days that followed, every media outlet wanted her. CNN called, then MSNBC, then NPR. Then The Atlantic offered a front-page exclusive, complete with archival photo spreads and a 5-part interview series. Publishers sent emails with 6-figure proposals for a memoir. Podcasters flooded her inbox. Even documentary filmmakers reached out, claiming they'd already begun treatment drafts. But Jasmine Crockett didn't respond. Not with conditions, not with negotiations. She simply said no. There was no press tour, no curated social media rollout, no pinned post with a clever quote, no TED Talk teaser or polished panel appearance. Instead, she returned to work. The real kind. Committee meetings, legislative reviews, late nights with policy binders and early mornings on subcommittee calls. While the rest of the world dissected her poise, framed her silence, and tried to sculpt her into a viral icon, she kept her head down and did the very thing she'd been mocked for on air. She represented. People were stunned. In an age when virality is currency, when outrage is monetized and every righteous moment comes with a merch line, Jasmine's refusal to capitalize was radical. Her silence wasn't absence, it was statement, and the longer it stretched, the more powerful it became. By week 2, the coverage had only grown. Think pieces titled, "When Silence Becomes Strategy," and the Crockett Code, Dignity in the Digital Age, flooded the landscape. Media experts scrambled to explain her playbook, searching for a brand angle that didn't exist. But that was the problem. Jasmine wasn't playing. She wasn't packaging. She wasn't building a moment. She was honoring it. And by choosing not to speak louder, she made everyone else listen harder. It unsettled pundits who expected her to ride the wave. It disappointed those who hoped she'd launch a podcast or announce a new foundation. But for millions of others, people who had grown tired of watching integrity get swallowed by performance, it felt like a return to something rare, leadership that didn't need to audition. Jasmine Crockett understood something her critics didn't. The moment wasn't about her voice. It was about everything she'd already said, and how she said it. Calm, clear, unearned but undeniable. She knew the media would spin itself dry trying to define her. So she left them in their own echo chamber and stepped quietly back into the halls of governance. And the world noticed. Because in the void she left, there wasn't confusion. There was clarity. She didn't need a spotlight. She already had something more dangerous: respect. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't live streamed. There were no reporters waiting outside the lecture hall, no coordinated rollout from her office, no special guest announcement on the university's social media. Jasmine Crockett simply walked onto campus one gray Wednesday afternoon, unaccompanied, carrying nothing but a worn leather tote, a spiral notebook, and the quiet confidence of someone who understood the weight of showing up where it mattered, not where it echoed. She wasn't there to speak to donors. She wasn't there for optics. She was there because she had been invited, not by a board but by students, and she said yes. The room was packed beyond capacity. Law students filled the auditorium, some sitting cross-legged in the aisles, others standing along the back wall. Professors lined the edges, not to lecture, but to listen. Jasmine sat on the edge of the desk, not behind the podium. Her blazer sleeves rolled to her elbows, one ankle crossed over the other. Posture relaxed but fully present. There was no script, just a conversation. No one recorded the first 45 minutes. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because it felt sacred. Until one voice broke through, hesitant, young, but steady. "What if they call me angry?" the student asked. A pause followed. It wasn't rhetorical, it was personal. A black woman in her second year, speaking not just for herself, but for everyone in that room who had ever been taught to sand down their edges to be heard. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't smile to diffuse the tension. She leaned in slightly and her voice dropped. Not in volume, but in precision. "Let them," she said. Another pause. "But be right when they do." The room didn't erupt. It held. That sentence didn't come with dramatic emphasis. It came like a truth someone had waited years to hear out loud. Someone near the front hit record on their phone without even realizing it. 60 seconds later, the moment had been captured. Not performed, not curated, just caught. That single clip traveled faster than any press release ever could. In 24 hours, it had been shared by professors at Yale and Howard, tweeted by authors, activists, and politicians. But most importantly, it was reposted by women across the country with captions like, "This right here." And she said it like she lived it, because she did. In that instant, Jasmine Crockett wasn't a congresswoman. She wasn't a viral icon. She wasn't a symbol. She was a mirror for every woman who had ever been labeled too much, too loud, too sharp, when all they had been was right. And in a world still teaching young voices to modulate, to soften, to shrink, Jasmine taught something else entirely. You don't have to make them comfortable. You just have to make sure they're wrong. It didn't take long before what Jasmine Crockett did that night, and what she didn't do, began to crystallize into something more permanent. What began as a singular act of poise became a framework. It started with a podcast. A group of young journalists at New York University launched a series titled Unedited, What They Didn't Expect Her to Say. The first episode broke down every second of the viral segment, from the camera angles to the choice of clip timing, from Pirro's rhetorical traps to Jasmine's refusal to take the bait. But it didn't stop there. They dug into how narratives are shaped, how guests are framed, how silence is manipulated, and how stillness, when used with intention, can flip an entire production inside out. Across the country, professors took note. Within weeks, courses on journalism ethics, political communication, and media literacy began incorporating the confrontation as a modern case study. One media professor at Stanford called it a masterclass in narrative reversal. At Columbia Law, it was folded into a unit on adversarial spaces and power negotiation. But the syllabus didn't just include the confrontation. It included Jasmine's silence afterward, the restraint, the refusal to tour the talk shows, the choice to let truth settle without decorating it. That too became part of the blueprint. And then came the students. They didn't just study the moment, they built from it. At Howard, Yale, and Spelman, students began organizing informal working groups called clarity circles. Their mission was simple: decode the tactics used to derail people like Jasmine and arm others with ways to respond, not with aggression, but with architecture. One group published a digital toolkit titled Let Her Speak, a guide to reclaiming narrative in hostile settings. It included breakdowns of segment structure, tips on mic placement and body framing, strategies for redirecting bias without escalating tone. The introduction read, "This isn't about winning, it's about staying intact." What Jasmine had done wasn't just remarkable, it was repeatable. And that's what frightened her opponents most. She hadn't just gone viral, she had left behind a method, a way for others, especially young Black women, to walk into spaces built to reduce them and remain undiminished. And so the blueprint spread, quietly, effectively, relentlessly, not in the form of slogans or hashtags. Those had already had their moment. But in syllabi, lesson plans, field guides, annotated videos, and whispered references between colleagues who knew exactly what it meant to be invited to speak and expected to fail. Jasmine never handed them this legacy. She didn't have to. She simply showed them what it looked like, and they wrote the rest themselves. Inside the network's glass towers, the silence wasn't calm. It was pressure. It pulsed behind every email, every delayed segment meeting, every last-minute programming shift. For a week, producers clung to the illusion that this was temporary, that the storm would pass, that Jeanine Pirro, queen of ratings and rhythm, would return. But by week 2, her name vanished from the internal programming slate. Not crossed out, not marked pending, just removed. And that's when the panic began. In conference rooms with dimmed lights and drawn blinds, senior executives gathered behind closed doors to ask the question no one wanted to put on paper. What if she can't come back? The risk wasn't political fallout, it was control. For years, they had mastered the machinery: when to amplify outrage, when to feed noise, when to silence contradiction with pre-cut segments and surgical editing. But Jasmine hadn't played along. She hadn't lost her temper. She hadn't stumbled into the trap. She'd walked in, rewired the entire format from inside the frame, and walked out without ever raising her voice. Now the machine stuttered. Internal memos began circulating under vague headers like upcoming Q3 segment guidance and guest engagement policy revisions. But between the lines, it was clear. They were rewriting the rules, not because they had discovered ethics, but because they had discovered exposure. What happened on air wasn't just public, it was permanent. And that permanence terrified them. One particularly damning report from the brand integrity team recommended a temporary restructuring of the Justice with Judge Jeanine brand to ensure alignment with evolving audience sensitivity metrics. Translation: the show was paused indefinitely. There was no farewell episode, no tribute, no digital montage of Jeanine's greatest takedowns. Just silence. Again. Except this time, it was institutional. Meanwhile, junior staffers whispered across editing bays, afraid to touch archived footage. Editors avoided reruns, Segment producers were instructed to comb through old scripts for anything out of tone. Legal asked for a fresh audit of on-air comments over the last 18 months. The walls hadn't caved in, but they were shifting, creaking with the weight of self-preservation. In one tense meeting, a mid-level executive muttered what everyone else was thinking. If this can happen to her, it can happen to any of us. And that was the truth they feared most. Because what Jasmine Crockett had proven wasn't just that the system was rigged. It was that it could be undone by its own footage, its own framing, its own forgotten mic left live. And now no one wanted to be the next segment. It began with an email. No fanfare. No press release. Just a plain subject line sent from the Standards and Practices Division to every anchor, producer, and segment editor at the network. Updated guest engagement protocols. Internal only. Attached was a 7-page PDF. The title was dry. Live Segment Conduct and Editorial Review Addendum, 2025 Q3. But those who opened it knew instantly. This wasn't policy refinement. This was a reset. Page 1 spelled it out in cautious corporate phrasing. To preserve journalistic integrity and minimize legal and reputational risk, all guest-facing segments must now comply with the following procedures. And there it was. Line after line of what had once been unspoken tactics now turned into formal restrictions. No more background footage from unverified sources. No more pre-edited montages used without context or guest consent. No more illustrative overlays unless directly sourced from the guest public record, and even then full clearance was required. But the real shift came further down the page. All confrontational live segments, especially those involving elected officials, civil rights leaders, or underrepresented voices, must now include uncut segment release clauses. Meaning, if a guest appears live, they are entitled to receive and publicly share the full unedited raw footage. No clips, no spin, no post-production edits disguised as clarity. It was unprecedented, and quietly it was an admission, not of wrongdoing. The memo never used that word, but of weakness, of vulnerability, of a fear now baked into policy that what happened once with Jasmine Crockett could happen again. And this time, they might not be able to bury it before it spread, because she hadn't just embarrassed a host, she had exposed a mechanism, and once a mechanism is visible, it becomes traceable. Inside the building, reactions were hushed but unmistakable. Veteran producers who once bragged about their ability to control the table suddenly found themselves on Zoom calls with compliance officers, re-reviewing footage they'd aired years ago. Editors groaned at the new constraints. Segment hosts whispered frustrations in dressing rooms about losing creative flexibility, but no one pushed back. Not loudly. Because they all knew what this was. This was containment. This was the wall, repainted after a crack. This was a network adjusting not because it wanted to, but because it had been forced to by a woman who never even raised her voice. And yet, even with the new rules, the system didn't apologize. It pivoted. Because institutions like this rarely say, "We were wrong." They say, "We are evolving." But evolution, however reluctantly it comes, still changes the game. Jasmine Crockett didn't write the memo. She didn't review the draft. She didn't demand it. She didn't have to. She had already rewritten the rules. 2 weeks after the confrontation aired, long after the hashtags had peaked and the sponsors had quietly adjusted their contracts, Jasmine Crockett walked onto the House floor with a small leather folder under her arm and a look not of defiance, but of design. No cameras followed her in. No statement had been teased to the press. But her team knew what this moment meant. She was here to write what the broadcast couldn't erase. Policy. What she introduced that morning was short, just 7 pages. But it hit the marrow of a decades-old loophole, the Media Clarity and Political Integrity Act. At its core, the bill required broadcast networks and digital platforms to disclose editorial alterations made to any segment involving elected officials, legislative debate, or public policy. If a clip was edited, condensed, or stitched, the bill mandated a simple, visible note. This content has been modified for clarity or time. Full version available at It didn't punish speech. It didn't dictate what could or couldn't air. It demanded only one thing: transparency. Jasmine didn't expect it to pass easily. She said as much on the record. Truth doesn't always win the vote, but it always deserves the floor. She knew committees would stall it, that lobbyists would line up to kill it, that networks would call it overreach and pundits would frame it as partisan. But she introduced it anyway, because someone had to, because silence could no longer be policy. The bill sparked what the broadcast had only begun: conversation. Within days, media watchdog groups threw their support behind it. Academics hosted panels debating its constitutional implications. Civil rights organizations applauded it as a defense of context in a time of weaponized distortion. But even more compelling was the response from the public. Viewers who had long suspected the cutaways, the frames, the missing seconds. Jasmine gave them language, a framework, a path. Critics, of course, fired back. Some called it symbolic. Others said it was a solution in search of a problem. But those who had watched her dismantle a setup in real time knew better. This wasn't symbolism, it was scaffolding. She wasn't trying to silence networks. She was forcing them to say what they were doing out loud. That was the threat. Not censorship, but sunlight. And in doing so, Jasmine had done what no viral moment alone could accomplish. She had turned spectacle into structure, heat into process, fire into law. It didn't matter if the bill passed on its first run, because the real legislation had already begun, in classrooms, in edits, in awareness. The rules were no longer hidden. The nation had seen the script, and Jasmine had shown them where to write in the margins. By the time the headlines moved on, Jasmine Crockett was still working. The studio lights were gone, the Twitter discourse had shifted to another scandal, and the memos from media executives had begun to fade into bureaucratic dust. But she remained, in hearings, in late-night draft reviews, in community town halls where no one was filming. The confrontation had given her national visibility, yes, but it had taken something too. Not her credibility, that had only sharpened. Not her career, that was thriving. What it cost her was quieter, heavier, and far less discussed. The emotional labor of simply staying composed when everything around her was engineered to break her down. People called her inspirational, brilliant, flawless under pressure, but they rarely asked how much it took to be all those things. Every time. What it took to walk into a studio designed to frame her as irrational and leave without a crack in her voice. What it took to watch someone try to collapse her into a caricature and still speak with grace, when her very dignity had been baited like a trap. Jasmine had won the room, the network, the internet, and the public's respect. But she'd also had to carry centuries of coded language, of racialized expectation, of professional double standards, all in one breath. And the bitter truth was this: she shouldn't have had to. She shouldn't have had to memorize not just her facts, but the emotional landscape of a room waiting for her to slip. She shouldn't have had to smile just enough to soften her strength, or sit still enough to make her passion palatable. She shouldn't have had to bring both receipts and restraint just to be granted the same airspace that others walked into freely. But she did, and she did it flawlessly. Still, in quiet moments, in her office, in elevators, in the soft silence of a car ride home, she let herself feel what the cameras never captured: the weight of always being on, the exhaustion of being a symbol when she only ever wanted to serve, the sorrow that her truth had to be performed so surgically just to be recognized as truth. Her victory had shifted a system, yes, but it had also revealed how rigged that system had been. How many before her had been silenced not because they lacked conviction, but because they didn't package it properly for prime time. Jasmine Crockett had made history, but history never asks how much it hurt. And in the echoes of her clarity, a deeper question remained. What kind of world demands that a woman be unshakable to be believed? And how many stories were buried simply because someone flinched? She didn't roar. She didn't blink. And somehow that was what changed everything. Jasmine Crockett didn't fight the way they expected her to. She didn't match volume for volume, insult for insult, gesture for gesture. She didn't storm off set or slam her fists on the desk. She didn't give the reaction they had prepped for in production meetings, the one the edit room was counting on. She simply refused to perform. And in that refusal, she rewrote the rules. What she did instead was quieter and more dangerous. She sat still. She held eye contact. She waited. She placed a USB drive on the table like a scalpel. She spoke calmly, not to defend her reputation, but to defend a truth older than the broadcast itself. That power isn't always loud, and dignity doesn't flinch. And now others are learning. Young women entering law school are studying her posture as much as her arguments. Interns entering newsrooms are asking different questions during orientation. Not about camera angles, but about narrative angles. Teachers are showing the clip in classrooms, not as entertainment, but as instruction. Not for the drama, but for the discipline. Because what Jasmine set wasn't a moment. It was a precedent. She proved that you could walk into a room built to reduce you and expand instead. That you could carry your ancestors' silence and still make the room echo with it. That you could be labeled angry and respond with accuracy. That you could be provoked and stay poised. That you could refuse the role, reject the script, and still own the screen. In doing so, she cracks something loose in the culture. A tremor now moves under every planned ambush, every segment designed to corner, every voice that once would have been drowned out in editing. Now producers hesitate. Now hosts second-guess their tone. Now networks have new protocols. Not because Jasmine demanded it, but because she made not changing riskier than changing. Her method has become shorthand. She didn't blink is whispered as encouragement in debate prep sessions. She didn't roar is written in margins of policy papers. She didn't fold is the caption under photos shared at rallies. Jasmine Crockett became a verb. Not because she branded herself, but because others found their voice through hers. She gave permission to speak without shouting, to correct without apologizing, to show evidence instead of emotion, to choose silence not as surrender, but as strategy. And now even those who tried to erase her moment can feel its shape in the spaces they once controlled. Because she didn't need to conquer the narrative, she clarified it. And clarity once seen cannot be undone. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits still and doesn't flinch. That was the lesson Jasmine Crockett left behind. Not as a headline, not as a soundbite, but as a quiet defiance that rippled far beyond the studio walls. She didn't raise her voice to be heard. She didn't break down to be believed. She simply existed, fully, fiercely, without permission, and in doing so, reminded the world that the most dangerous thing a woman can do in a room that wants to break her is not react the way it expects. She came to represent. And she did. When she said, "I'm not here to audition for your tolerance. I'm here to represent the truth." It wasn't just a line. It was a mirror. For every woman who had ever been talked over. For every young voice told to be less. For every black girl who had ever been called too much for simply stating a fact. Jasmine spoke to them without raising her tone. And in doing so, she showed them they didn't have to raise theirs either. Not to be heard, but to be clear. What she endured wasn't just a media ambush. It was centuries of expectation pressed into a single segment. Be soft, but strong. Be assertive, but never angry. Be passionate, but don't speak too fast. Be prepared, but not intimidating. Be visible, but not too visible. Jasmine didn't bend to any of it. She didn't adapt her fire to fit their format. She forced the format to adjust to the weight of her truth. That's what power looks like when it doesn't need to announce itself. When it moves with intention instead of intensity. When it listens, waits, and then lands. Not to dominate, but to disarm. And in that stillness, Jasmine proved that clarity, not charisma, is what makes history. She reminded us that not every battle is won with volume. That sometimes strength is simply the refusal to blink when the whole room is watching. That sometimes the loudest act of resistance is silence laced with purpose. And that truth, when spoken plainly and held firmly, does not need applause to echo. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive a system designed to miscast her. She exposed it. She didn't just navigate the narrative. She rewrote it. And for every person who has ever walked into a room, they weren't supposed to own and decided to take up space anyway, not by shouting, but by not backing down. Her story stands as a testament. Because justice, in its most human form, doesn't demand permission. It just stands its ground. And when it does, the world doesn't look away. It listens. And maybe that's the lesson we carry, that courage isn't always declared in headlines or etched into speeches. Sometimes it lives in the quiet decision to stay composed when chaos calls. Sometimes it's choosing not to retaliate when the world begs for performance, but instead anchoring yourself so deeply in truth that nothing can shake it loose. Jasmine Crockett taught us that representation isn't about spectacle. It's about presence. She showed us that you don't have to match the volume of injustice to expose it. You simply have to endure it without surrendering what makes you whole. Her story is not just about one woman or one night in a studio. It is a reflection of many. Those who were told to wait their turn, to change their tone, to smile more, to shrink for the comfort of others. And yet they stayed. They persisted. They held the line so that one day clarity would no longer be a battle, but a given. What you've just witnessed is not a documentary record or a literal account. It is a reflection, an artistic rendering drawn from the shadows of a deeper truth that lives in all of us. If it stirred something in you, let it. If it unsettled, good. Growth never comes wrapped in comfort. And if you remember only one thing, let it be this. You don't have to roar to be heard. You just have to refuse to be erased.